we're very lucky today to have Lee Frelich speaking to us about forest management and tree planting for climate change mitigation. And Lee is the director of the University of Minnesota Center for Forest Ecology. He received a Ph.D. in Forest Ecology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1986. Go Badgers. I also went to UW-Med. And he has authored more than 200 publications with 287 co-authors from 26 countries, including major works for Cambridge University Press and Oxford University Press. He is listed among the top 1% of all scientists in the world in the Ecology and Environment category by the Web of Science. His research has been featured in the news and media 500 times, including such venues as the New York Times, Newsweek, and the Washington Post. He has also provided consulting services on forest management for the U.S. Army, Air Force, National Forest Service, and National Park Service. His current research interests include large-scale fire and wind, earthworm invasion, and climate change in temperate and boreal forests. So Lee, I'll turn it over to you, and very excited for your talk tonight.
Okay, thanks for that introduction. Let me share my screen here. There we go. And so I've decided to cast this in terms of planetary health because last night I gave a presentation to the mini medical school at the University of Minnesota, and they're doing a planetary health series. And so, because they're interested in human health and planetary health. So it's a new way for me to express the topic. So here is global tree cover as of 2015. And actually, as we'll see in a few minutes, this is a lot less than it could be. So there was actually a lot more forest before people started cutting forests down. And what are the drivers of this loss? So if you look on this map, which shows different things that happened to forests from 2000 to 2015, looks like an absolute disaster, right? All the green areas were affected by forest operations of some sort of harvesting. All the brown areas had wildfires. I mean, look at all this in Russia. They had a 40 million acre fire last summer in Russia. Look at all this in Alaska and Canada. The gray area is minor loss or no loss, and you see some of that here above Lake Superior in the middle of the Amazon, but not a lot, unfortunately. Yellow is shifting agriculture. You see a lot of that in parts of South America and Africa. But the really bad part here is the red, which you see in the southern part of Brazil and over here in Indonesia and Borneo. And that is deforestation for permanent agriculture. Actually, the forestry part, the green part here, and the fire part, for reasons I'll tell you in a minute, is actually not that bad. And also the shifting agriculture, really not that bad for forests. It's not as much of a disaster as it looks like on this map. It's really the red areas that are important. Forest clearing for, oil palm, not Pam, although they do make Pam out of it. But anyway, and cattle grazing in the Amazon are leading to permanent clearing of forests. And of course, we created our hundreds of millions of acres of cornfields and soybean fields decades ago and did the same thing. So in terms of the fires and the other disturbances, a lot of people don't realize that most of the carbon in forests that are disturbed by big forest fires or windstorms is still present after the disturbance. Usually only 10 to 20% of the carbon is actually turned into CO2 in a forest fire. There can be a few exceptions. Younger stands with small trees in the far north can give off almost all their carbon, but usually 80 or 90% of the carbon is still there, and then a new forest grows up around it. And it takes many decades for those old trees that have been killed to rot away. So actually, these natural disturbances actually maximize the amount of carbon that's stored. Much more is removed in harvest, and not only it's all the industrial processes where the wood is processed, cutting it down, hauling it to the mill, hauling the wood products to the point where they're sold, and so on, emits a lot of CO2, more than in a forest fire. Here's an unsalvaged burned forest, Pagami Creek in the Boundary Waters of 2011. It should be obvious here that most of the carbon is still present. This was a flaming front 300 feet high, so an extraordinarily intense fire, and yet most of the carbon is still here. And one of the things is if you salvage a forest like this, go in and salvage the timber, you squish the seedlings, which are only an inch high in the first year after the fire, and end up emitting a lot more carbon out of the soil by churning it up and so on, and it does a lot of damage. And the ecologists are in favor of not salvaging and letting the forest respond naturally to the disturbance, and it will sequester a lot more carbon in that case. Forests are actually designed by evolutionary history to recover after natural disturbances. All forests are perpetuated by disturbance of some sort, whether it's just individual trees dying and forming gaps or big forest fires. And salvaging just damages the recovery process. And here you see a forest that was blown down and burned, and 4 years later, you've got hundreds of thousands of trees per acre. And this is also in the boundary waters. So they are designed to recover after natural disturbances. And then there are other types of forests like our northern hardwoods, sugar maple, hemlock, beech, linden, and oak forests. That the older they get, the more carbon they store. And a lot of people confuse the fact that young forests uptake carbon at a higher rate, and they confuse that with the amount of carbon that's actually stored on the landscape. So if you cut forests on a short rotation, you will end up with much less carbon stored on the landscape and more carbon in the atmosphere than if you let forests get old, because they may not take it up as high a rate, but they have such a huge amount of storage. Upwards of 100 tons per acre is stored there. And natural disturbances don't upset that very much, but human disturbances do. So don't let anybody fool you that young forests that are growing at a high rate are taking up carbon. You put a huge amount of carbon in the atmosphere when you cut down the forest in order to make way for the young forest. So there's no net gain in carbon sequestered and taken out of the atmosphere there. We have such things still on this planet as intact forests. And these are forest areas that have never been clear cut. They may have had some selective logging. They have a continuous heritage of natural disturbance going back thousands or even millions of years in some cases, and close to nature human disturbance processes, because the indigenous people worked with the natural disturbance processes in the forest. And these intact forests include the Amazon, the Congo, some big tracts across Russia, still some in Borneo and New Guinea, not not anywhere near as much as there was 20 or 30 years ago. The Komi Virgin Forest is here in Russia. It has like 5 or 6 million acres that was never logged. The biggest chunk, though, is Alaska and across Canada. It's the biggest intact forest in the world. And we need to leave these intact forest landscapes alone. They should be wild land reserves of some sort. There's been some progress with that in Canada. Right up here in northern Ontario, north of Lake Nipigon, is Wabakimi. It's a new, relatively new provincial park. 5 million acres, never been logged. Much wilder than the Boundary Waters. If you go to portage your canoe there, you might be at the top of a 100-foot cliff, and there's just like a piece of flagging at the bottom of the cliff that shows where you need to go, and it's up to you to figure out how to get your canoe down the cliff. Very, very remote and wild. These intact landscapes hold most of the Earth's terrestrial biodiversity, and they store huge amounts of carbon, which we need to leave in place. Any disturbance we do is only going to cause net emissions to the atmosphere. And not only that, by studying these intact forests, we can learn the natural processes that are going on and use that as a blueprint for better management, what we call close to nature forestry that is better at sequestering carbon and retaining the native biodiversity. What you see here is the Porcupine Mountains in Upper Michigan, which is an intact forest landscape. There's 35,000 acres, everything you see in this picture that was never logged, with hemlock and maple trees. It's where I did my Ph.D. research on natural disturbance regimes. One of my hemlocks was 540 years old. So forests store more carbon when they're allowed to get old, when they have intact species diversity, when they respond naturally to natural disturbances, and when they exist in an intact landscape. This picture is from Wolsfeld Woods, which is a natural area in the western suburbs that's open to the public. So again, the tree cover, and I'm going to highlight these areas with the stars. I mean, these are areas where they are susceptible to loss of forest in a changing climate. So the problem with climate change is that the amount of acreage where forests may be able to grow in the future might shrink because of climate change, which would tend to convert a lot of areas where forests can grow today into grasslands, especially in these areas. And the Amazon in particular is close to a tipping point where it could become a savanna. But so are these areas along the southern boreal in Europe and Russia, and even right here in Minnesota. In fact, the southern boreal from northern Minnesota up to northern Alberta, north of Edmonton, is one of the tipping points in the IPCC report, because with a business as usual warming scenario, the southernmost 300 miles of that forest could die and become a climate that would mostly support grasslands. And that would be a gigantic amount of carbon into the atmosphere. The same with the Amazon and in Europe and Asia, where the prairie forest border basically goes east and west across Kazakhstan and Russia and into Mongolia and northeastern China. So we are an example of one of these tipping points. For a high emission scenario, we would warm up about 13 degrees in mean summer temperature in Minnesota. Whereas with a low emission scenario, only 4 or 5, this is Fahrenheit here. Don Wubbles and I used this slide in Washington, D.C. They don't have Celsius in Washington, D.C. So 13 degrees Fahrenheit, which would make us equal to the middle of Kansas, whereas 5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer would only make us like Des Moines, Iowa. So that's the best we can hope for, is that we'll be like Des Moines instead of the middle of Kansas. In Minnesota, of course, as I said in a previous presentation, way back when this chapter first formed, is unique because we have these biome boundaries. We have the boreal in the north. Those are the coldest forests on the planet, dominated by spruce and fir and jack pine, birch, and aspen. And we have the temperate deciduous in the lighter green, oak, maple, basswood, and then the grassland climates. So here's our boreal on the north shore of Lake Superior. That's what it looks like. This is mostly white spruce and balsam fir in this picture. Here's our temperate deciduous. This is a sugar maple forest. And prairie, of course. But the thing is, we are one of those tipping points, and the prairie landscape could move into the forest in Minnesota. Basically, from our research, we know that the difference between temperate and boreal forest is determined by mean summer temperature. The crossover point is 64.6 degrees mean summer temperature for the months of June, July, and August. So warmer than that, you get temperate forest. So if it gets that warm in northern Minnesota, the boreal forest will die. And if it's colder than 62, you're likely to have boreal forest. And of course, summer temperatures up there are, pretty close to the crossover already. And then whether you can have any forest at all is determined by the climatic moisture index. And basically, if precipitation is more than evaporation, it's a forest climate. And if evaporation is more than precipitation, you have a negative balance, then it's a prairie climate. And if the climate changes to a prairie climate, the trees are going to die, they're going to decay, they're not going to be replaced with other trees like they would after a natural forest disturbance where the forest regenerates, and therefore all that carbon will end up in the atmosphere. So here is our mapping of the biomes right now, and you can see the boreal in northeastern Minnesota, mixed boreal and temperate is the minty green, the yellow is the temperate broadleaf with maple, oak, and basswood, and then the prairie is the brown. So for the low emission scenario, if we were to somehow, by some miracle, follow the scenario agreed to in Paris in 2015, for example, Minnesota would warm up a little bit, but it wouldn't be a whole lot different than it is now, as you can see on this upper map. On the other hand, with the business as usual, we become the new Kansas. Here, and about 90% of the state would have a climate that would only support grassland. And those grasslands would sequester huge amounts of carbon, but it would take them a couple of centuries to do that. And in the meantime, all the carbon from the forest would go in the atmosphere, and that's just really bad timing. Because we can't wait for a few centuries for the carbon storage in Minnesota to recover. The next few decades are really, really important. And it was this map which resulted from my research that resulted in the quote to the Washington Post that we have a good, perfectly good Kansas now. We don't need a second Kansas in Minnesota. Which landed on the front page in the first paragraph of an article in the Washington Post, which allowed me to see what type of feedback you get from all over the world from people who believe in climate change and people who don't believe in climate change. But that's what could happen, and that would go all the way up to Edmonton, 1,500 miles essentially, where about 300 miles of forest along the prairie forest border would die. So that's a huge amount of carbon. That's why it's shown as one of the tipping points. And if you look on a continent-wide biome analysis, this heavy black line is the current boreal forest. The brown is grasslands. The The brighter greens and yellows are temperate forest. And this is what it would be with that business as usual scenario. So the black line is still where the boreal forest is today. You can see all of this here, which changes to yellow, would be boreal forest changing to temperate forest. And after 2 or 3 centuries, the carbon sequestration would catch up, but there would be a period of transient dynamics where the boreal forest would die. And it would take 200 or 300 years for the temperate trees to move in and establish a new forest. So essentially, all that carbon would go in the atmosphere. And then this brown area from northwestern Minnesota all the way up to northern Alberta and even up into the Yukon and the Northwest territories would become grassland, and all that carbon would go in the atmosphere. And again, it would take new grasslands established there several centuries to sequester the amount of carbon that's currently in that forest. So basically, an area of forest at least 6 times the size of Minnesota could be converted to other biomes for the business as usual scenario. Similar story in Europe. This is some research I did with the National Academy of Sciences in Poland, where we looked at current and future range of trees. This is Norway spruce, one of their major conifers, and this green area is where it grows today. The red in the map on the right is where it would not grow with a business as usual warming scenario. So all that would die. Same with Scots pine. So those are their 2 main forest forming species. If Scots pine's southern boundary would be way up in Finland, that means this would be replaced by temperate forest there. Same problem as in North America. It would take several centuries for that new forest to sequester the carbon, and in the eastern part here, it would be grassland that would replace the forest. When you get into Ukraine and the Ural Mountains of Russia and Kazakhstan and on eastwards, it would be 300 miles of boreal forest replaced by grasslands, just like in the central part of North America. So what can we do about that in terms of tree planting? So this is potential tree cover in the world, about 10.9 billion acres. So this shows all the areas that could support trees. So there's more area covered here than in the map I showed earlier, which only shows 6.9 billion acres. So there's 4 billion acres of forest areas with a forest climate that don't have forest, and that's because of human activity. And about half of that, it turns out, is not needed for agriculture. So these are potential areas for restoration of trees, about 2.2 billion acres. That's about the size of the United States, or about 6% of the Earth's land surface area. We could plant 1 trillion trees. You've probably heard of the Trillion Tree Project. 1 trillion trees would fill 2.2 billion acres. It would be about 125 seedlings per person globally. And so whenever I ask the students in one of my classes, is it possible for us to plant 125 seedlings for each person on the planet over the next 10 years? The answer is, of course it is. If your grandmother can't plant seedlings, you could plant 250, to make up for the fact that somebody else wasn't physically able to do it over 10 years. I mean, it's really quite doable to plant 1 trillion trees and fill those 2.2 billion acres. If that were to happen, it would reduce the atmospheric CO2 content by 100 parts per million over about a 50-year period, which is really good timing for us, because that's exactly when we need less CO2. And that would buy time to switch to renewable energy, because 100 parts per million in 50 years would basically equal what we would emit if we continue burning fossil fuel at the same rate. So it would stabilize the CO2 content and give us time to switch to renewable energy. However, globally, we're in a race to reforest these acreages before climate change reduces the area where there are suitable climates for forests, as I explained in the last few slides. One project is our GreenAgain Madagascar project, which is associated with the University of Minnesota. One of our former graduate students, Matt Hill, here, who gave us these pictures, started this project. He was a Wall Street hedge fund manager, and one day he quit doing that. He moved to Minnesota. He got a master's in forestry at the University of Minnesota, and then he moved to Madagascar. Ended up marrying one of the local people there, and started this project. So the tropical rainforests of Madagascar originally occupied this purple zone. The mainland of Africa is right here. So it's a few hundred miles off the African coast. The island's almost 1,000 miles long. So that was the rainforest, which has 7,000 species of plants not found anywhere else on the planet. And only 11% of it still exists. And we're trying to reforest that. So the star is where we're working. And so we have now a nursery that's growing 58 species of native trees. And believe it or not, about 40% of them don't even have a scientific name. So we're just using the name that the local Malagasy people called the tree, until botanists assign a scientific name to these trees. We're on the Plant for Planet website now. So you can go to Plant for the Planet, and there are dots all over the world. You can click on any dot and it will show you the local project, and you can donate money to it right then. So if you want to donate to planting in the Amazon or in Western North America or Europe, or ours, which is GreenAgain Madagascar, they're all on Plant for the Planet. These are some of our employees. We employ about 80 people there, and they're all being paid what are very good wages, actually, for Madagascar. And that's because there's a 10-to-1 difference from the United States to Madagascar. So if you spend $1,000 in Madagascar, it's like spending 10,000 in the United States. So when people donate money, it's really leveraged a lot. And the thing about reforestation is it requires local knowledge to grow and plant the right species in the right places, the right soil conditions. Does it grow on hilltops, in valleys, north slopes, south slopes, whatever? Requires local knowledge everywhere in the world to do reforestation correctly. Well, in this picture, you see our local knowledge for our project in Madagascar. I mean, people there have been living in the forest with the trees. When it's time for dinner, they go out and pick dinner from the trees and bring it in and make dinner. So that's one reason why they're so interested in reforesting, because the trees produce, not only when they get big, useful timber products, but they're also food producing trees. There's a lot of species with fruit and nuts and so on. So restoration of forest requires knowing which native species will do well in a normal climate. Are there species, neo-native species that are in a different climate right now that you could bring in? How the landform influences the local climate. You need that local knowledge, as I just said, and you need follow-up care for the planted trees. None of this plant and abandon, where 80 or 90% of you feel good because you planted 1 million trees or something in a big effort, and then they're just abandoned and they all die. Well, if a tree dies, we replace it. We monitor the planting sites at GreenAgain for Madagascar. And we also pull weeds. We're doing experiments to see what level of weeding do you need to do to make survival rates higher, what season of the year you should plant, given that there's a dry season and a wet season, and so on. And there are some species that do better if you plant them in the dry season, and others that do better if you plant them in a wet season. So we're augmenting the local knowledge of the people of Madagascar with some scientific experiments to find out even more. And any site around the world which is vetted by Plant for the Planet will have standards like follow-up care, so that trees actually become established using only local native species, using a wide variety of species if you can, paying good wages to the local people. They have a lot of standards, and there are over 100 sites around the world where you can donate money, and tens of millions of trees, if not hundreds of millions, are being planted every year under the auspices of Plant for the Planet, which was started by a teenager in Germany 10 years ago, a 13-year-old kid who's now an adult, of course, started Plant for the Planet, and it's part of the Trillion Tree Project, and is probably the biggest part of the Trillion Tree Project. And as I said, GreenAgain Madagascar is vetted by Plant for the Planet. And, we had to fill out this form that was like 20 pages long that gives all this information. And they're also going to visit our sites next year to make sure that we're telling the truth. So around here, what can we plant given that the climate is warming? Well, disease-resistant elms are great. There are lots of disease-resistant elms. The St. Croix is a local one. There's Princeton, Prairie Expedition, and New Harmony are all varieties of, they are American elms. They were just found not to be susceptible to Dutch elm disease. Very drought resistant, very heat resistant. And you see here a street in Minneapolis that was accidentally planted with Princeton elms 50 or 60 years ago. And of course, elm disease didn't take them out. They're very characteristic because they have a perfect vase shape. So Princeton elms are very easy to identify. Oaks will be good in Minnesota in a warmer climate. We have 7 species in Minnesota. Northern red black oak is already native in southeastern Minnesota. We could probably plant it in the Twin Cities already. Northern pin oak is already here, commonly planted as an ornamental, as is northern red. And then in the white oak subfamily, we have bur oak, as everybody knows, I'm sure. Swamp white oak, which is the one that a lot of people think is bur oak, but it's not really. The leaves are much more even. It's the one that's planted on boulevards between the streets and sidewalks because it has a root system that's it can tolerate really harsh urban conditions. White oak, and then a lot of people don't realize that chinkapin oak or yellow oak is native to Houston County, Minnesota. And with the warming we've had, you could probably plant it in the Twin Cities already. And then hackberry is great, and Kentucky coffee tree is a really good option. Very heat tolerant and drought tolerant trees. Caution for sugar maple. I mean, it has the most beautiful flowers in the spring, as you can see in the upper right here. The best color palette in the fall of any tree in the world, I think. Maple syrup, really great looking lumber, but it's going to be sensitive to where you plant it in a warmer climate. So if you look at where it grows naturally, it's always the north side of a hill. If you look in a natural forest or a place with really deep silty soil with a high water holding capacity. Landform and soil effects will be more important in a warmer climate. So the warmer it gets, the more species like sugar maple will be restricted to deep silty soils or north-facing hillsides. And bur oak, of course, will be the one that you can plant on south-facing hillsides. Here is the north side of a hill in the Cannon River Wilderness area, which is in southeastern Minnesota. Here is the south side of that same hill. This is bur oak and white oak in an oak savanna. And some of the neonatives, in other words, species native just to our south that we could consider planting here, sycamore. Actually, they're planting sycamore in Minneapolis already. Shagbark hickory, scarlet oak. It turned out there was some native scarlet oaks right near Madison. The most beautiful oak in the fall, just incredible red foliage. And I did hear that one nursery was already selling them here. They've had it at the Arboretum for 10 or 15 years. So it got through the polar vortex of 2019, so we know it's hardy here. But it's going to be adapted to a warmer, drier climate. And even tulip tree. Within a few years, tulip tree will be able to be planted in the Twin Cities. There were a few on campus on a south-facing hillside. So to stop climate change and to summarize this whole thing about forests, we need to keep all our intact forests intact, all those remote wild forests. We need to restore commercial forests using close to nature forestry practices, where we learn from those intact forests how the forest works and adjust our harvesting and other forest management practices to be in sync with natural processes. Let more forests get older and reforest deforested areas. And so we should consider restoring, reforesting, or otherwise rewilding large acreages. As I said, those 2.2 billion acres with the climate appropriate vegetation type, and that will cool the planet and sequester large amounts of CO2. With the business as usual scenario, we could be the new Kansas. However, the things I've been talking about are in green here: stop deforestation, plant trees, restoration, rewilding. I've already covered that. And then, of course, there's alternative energy, more efficient cars and buildings. And the one I like is that people don't talk about a lot is eat more plants. And last night I learned at the mini medical school from one of the other faculty members who presented that if people were to eat most of their calories from plants, it would free up 500 million acres of land that could be rewilded. If you can imagine Iowa being like 50% wildland instead of all corn and soybeans. 500 million acres there that where we're growing crops just to feed cows. And we need to put that land back into wild vegetation in order to restore planetary health. So that's what I learned last night. So I had to edit this slide to put that in. And this is, if there's time for questions, this is me and one of my friends. This is an English oak at the Rogalin Palace in Poznan, Poland. Yeah, oak trees get really big there. I wish oak trees would get that big here, but anyway. So do we have any questions? Or did I blow all of the time already?
I have my
Yeah.
hand raised.
Go ahead, Bill.
Thank you. I'm curious about, I think they're called engineered wood products, beams that are made out of laminated wood. I've heard that if we switch to using more of those instead of steel and concrete, that we can have a big impact on climate change. But I'm wondering, how does that really work out in terms of the ability of forests to absorb carbon?
Yeah, well, the thing about engineered wood is you can make it out of smaller pieces of wood, so you don't necessarily have to cut down really big old trees, which is a bad thing to do for the planet. Um, and what engineers are thinking about there is the fact that when you make steel or concrete, you emit a lot of CO2 in the manufacturing process. And so the buildings made out of steel or concrete represent a lot of CO2 that's been emitted to the atmosphere. And if they can develop ways of making those steel and concrete that are carbon neutral, then the advantage would go away. People might still want to use it though, because a lot of people like natural wood materials. They're building high rises now in Europe out of wood. I mean, not extremely tall, but 15 or 20 stories. And I heard there was a high rise in Milwaukee that was going to be made out of wood as well. So it's a complicated thing. A lot of engineers are working on how to make concrete and make it carbon neutral, by pairing it up with solar or whatever they need to do in the manufacturing process. And if they succeed in that, then it's just a matter of which material you prefer at that point, but we're not quite there yet.
Lee, when you first started on forest loss, you had a category called yellow shifting agriculture. Could you describe exactly what that is versus permanent agriculture?
Yeah, shifting agriculture is where it's usually indigenous people, and they make small clearings in the forest. They grow crops, then they abandon that and move to a new area which they clear, and then the old area gets reforested. And actually, that's not very destructive to forests if you do it the way indigenous people practiced it for thousands of years before the contemporary era. Because each of those clearings is surrounded by intact forest, and all the seeds of all those species can come in from all directions, and it can really recover remarkably fast. What we call the ecological legacy, which is how much of the original ecology, the seeds, the fungi in the soil, everything you need for an ecosystem, how much of that survives the disturbance of that shifting agriculture? Well, it's almost everything survives, and they recover to forest very quickly, and you can hardly even tell that anything happened 10 or 20 years later. Whereas permanent agriculture, of course, totally wipes out the legacy. Microbes, seeds, everything, and they tend to be quite big areas, and it's hard. Recovery is difficult just because of the distances species have to disperse. And unfortunately, in Madagascar, they got away from the small scale shifting agriculture when the population really boomed into permanent deforestation, and that's what we're trying to reverse. It seems like the local people are ready. They've realized that, and they're the ones that come to us asking to be part of GreenAgain. Now we don't even have to advertise anymore.
Was that a synonym for native seed bank earlier?
Yeah, it's called ecological legacy.
Okay.
Yeah, it includes the seeds, it includes the microbes that form relationships with the tree roots and the seeds to make them germinate. And it even includes things like dead wood. I explained that after a fire, you have all this dead wood, which is case hardened by the fire and will not decay for decades. And that is an important part of the forest. It's woodpecker habitat. It will decay very slowly and slowly release its nutrients as the new forest grows and so on. So if you look at ecological legacy, there's the below ground, which is microbial. There's the surface and above ground, which is seeds and like the actual dead wood from the former forest. And you can imagine that agriculture like we practiced it here, which with plowing, you're destroying the entire legacy. So it's really hard to restore a forest on a cornfield. Whereas with the shifting agriculture, the way it was practiced for thousands of years by indigenous people, the legacy is all around them, and the forests recover tremendously fast there.
I was reading about a ghost forest earlier. It was a study that came out that was published back in February of this year by Melinda Martinez. She was talking about how ghost forests are releasing a bunch of methane from the microbes that are all in the decaying wood, and how they're slow, like it's a transition to like a marshland.
Yeah, is this in bogs, in peatlands?
It was a study from North Carolina State.
Okay,
So,
yeah, because there's a lot of different types of ghost forests actually around the world. I mean, there's ghost forests in upper Michigan that were buried in sand dunes, and then the sand dunes moved on thousands of years later. But anyway, there's a lot of wetland forests, and in the far north, peatland forests. Even the big bog in northern Minnesota that could be at risk in a warmer climate to emit huge amounts of methane and go from a peatland to a marshland. And believe it or not, there's a lot of peatlands also in tropical areas, especially in the Southeast Asian tropical forests often have peat meters thick on the forest floor. Because it's built out of species that accumulated over thousands of years that just don't decay very fast, and it rains so much that it's just too wet and there isn't enough oxygen, because to decay you need a mixture of water and oxygen. If it's very wet and there's no oxygen, it won't decay. If it's dry and there's a ton of oxygen, it won't decay. It's when you get that optimum mixture of water and oxygen and the right temperature for the microbes that it'll decay. And unfortunately, the whole tundra in North America and in Russia is getting warmer, and is just kind of entering that sweet zone for just the right conditions for all that accumulated peat to decay.
Yeah, Hobie has a question.
thank you.
Yeah.
Lee, thank you. This is fascinating. I'm told I should worry about using toilet paper because of the destruction of the sort of borderline taiga forests. And the substitute is supposed to be bamboo. I don't know what the carbon footprints of either of those are, either in the growing or that, but do you have any insight on whether we should all be using bamboo toilet paper?
Well, I don't know anything about bamboo toilet paper. I know bamboo is pretty sustainable because it regrows very readily, and very quickly and very easily. It's just a big grass, actually. But I don't know about bamboo toilet paper, but I do know that in Canada, they are turning the boreal forest into toilet paper. Yeah, they're clear cutting 10 miles further north every year, and they won't stop until they get to the tundra. Very typical Canadian forest management. So that's why a lot of ecologists are pushing to set aside all of that intact forest there as wildland reserves. And we made some progress with Wabakimi, which is a 5 million acre, and there's a couple of those in Quebec now, and northern Saskatchewan, northern Manitoba, northern Alberta. And so there are a number of big nature reserves being set aside in those areas. And believe it or not, Vladimir Putin, who I generally don't like, has set aside the 5 million acre Komi virgin forest in the Ural Mountains, which has never been logged as a strict nature reserve. Like, people aren't even allowed to go off of the road there. It's what they call a strict nature reserve in Russia. Only researchers are allowed to go off of a few main hiking trails and roads. So the guy is only 99% bad.
I'm hoping there's time for one more question. I use the En-ROADS model to talk about climate change. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's a simulator that allows you to try out solutions. And one of the knobs, the control knobs in this En-ROADS simulator is afforestation, as well as deforestation. You can reduce deforestation and you can encourage afforestation. Mm-hmm. And when you slide those knobs to the maximum, it doesn't have that much of an effect. And one of the reasons is because it takes so long for forests, or new forests, I guess, to reach the point where they're taking up large amounts of carbon. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, there's a delay of 1 to 2 decades. So if we plant the 2 billion acres now, say in the next 10 years into forest, 30, 40, and 50 years from now, they will sequester huge amounts of carbon. But yeah, there is that delay. And they grow fast in a relative sense when they're young, but not in an absolute sense, right? So, yeah. But by the time they're 20, 30 years old, the absolute amount of carbon going in, if you did it right and you planted the right species in the right area and you used the proper planting practices, like Plant for the Planet recovers, you can sequester huge amounts of carbon. And that's right when we're really going to need it, is 30, 40, and 50 years from now. We just have to think ahead and start it now. Yeah, and I don't know what assumption they're using in that model for how much of a delay there is, or, it's unlikely that they have something that takes into account all the different forests in the world. I mean, if you look at it from my point of view as a forest ecologist, I could optimize the growth of every forest everywhere on the planet, and it would take up a lot more CO2 than if you just look in the literature and take some average. That local knowledge is really, really important. You will get a lot more growth if you have the follow-up care in the first few years after planting, and if you put the right species on the right soil types. And there probably isn't enough information from everywhere in the world to make that very accurate in the model.
Yeah. It basically, you have to use afforestation or you can't get to a sustainable solution. You have to eventually reach net negative carbon in order to recover, and if you don't put in afforestation and reducing deforestation, you can't achieve that. But
Yep.
It seems clear that, it's not a panacea. It won't make up for failing to provide other solutions like electrification of transportation.
Yep, that's right. And like I said, if we did tree planting on a massive scale, it would stretch out the time frame so that we had a few extra decades to make a complete transition to renewable energy, which is necessary, even if you stop all deforestation and go forward with the maximum possible tree planting, we still ultimately have to go to renewable energy. It just helps us along the way, and at the same time, it makes the health of the planet in so many other ways better.
Yeah. Can I sneak one last question in here?
Sure.
Our group has been discussing in-person meetings, some gathering for quite some time, and we're always struggling for what to do. I'm wondering if like a tree planting might be something like an Arbor Day event. And Lee, is there anything a place that we can go that we can plant trees? I mean, my yard has plenty of trees, where.
Yeah, there could be. I mean, the DNR, the Nature Conservancy, there's a group in the Twin Cities called Great River Greening.
Okay.
Yeah, and then there's another group called Friends of the Mississippi. It could be, and they schedule tree planting events usually in May. It could be that one of those groups has an event because a lot of them use volunteer labor, especially Great River Greening and Friends of the Mississippi. I think they specialize in organizing volunteers so that the labor for planting trees is essentially free.
A question, how many people would be interested in something like that for a gathering?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, we could contact those particular groups and see if there's an event they have coming up next spring, because they plan those events. Usually January, February, and March is like intensive planning of those events because trees need to be planted in May usually. And they'll usually do prairies later in the summer because they restore prairies as well, depending on the site.
Thank
So
At least last year, FMR had to turn people away because they had too many volunteers. So that would definitely be something to see if you can organize one with them for like a separate event or something. Just so we know, oh, too many people today.
yeah.
Can I sneak one more question in?
Yeah.
So what should I go ask my city council to do?
Oh boy, what city are you in?
Plymouth.
Plymouth, okay. Well, that's not too far from, well, I'm in Minneapolis, it's not far away. Well, you should make sure that they have a plan for having a tree in every available slot throughout the city. Like Minneapolis has an inventory that includes every tree in the city, is it like in a database? And they also have slots that are open where there could be a tree and isn't. And they make plans to fill those slots, like there should be a tree every 30 feet or whatever along every street in the city. So do they have that type of an urban forestry program so that they're filling all the available slots with trees and the right type of tree? Do they have the expertise to make sure it's the right type of tree and that it's planted properly? Which is a bigger deal than you think, because I see thousands of trees around the metro area that live for 5 years and die because they were planted too deep. The root flare is not at the surface of the soil, or they have girdling roots because they didn't cut the root ball when they planted it, and all sorts of, in Minneapolis, they have the best forestry staff in the United States. And they plant 60 different species. They plant them almost all bare roots so they can make sure the roots are properly arranged. So do you have that type of expertise in Plymouth? And are there any natural areas in Plymouth, like abandoned lands, just open fields or something that could be turned into a forest?
I'd like to say a couple things. Thanks, Lee, for the great talk. I really appreciated the presentation. Tim, I think we can start with our own backyard. So if you have any place to put a tree or two in your own yard, I think we all should keep that in mind. No better place than our own backyards. And it doesn't necessarily always have to be trees to store carbon, of course, so we can replace our turf lawns with wildflowers and shrubs that have deep rooting things as well. So Lee, I planted thousands of trees myself in restoration work. And some of the biggest challenges, of course, is keeping some of your newly planted tree seedlings hydrated during their initial growth phase, because and as we now know that the projections indicate with climate change for Minnesota and parts of the Great Lakes, is that we're going to have droughtier conditions during that growing season and moist conditions when the soil temperature is not so warm. Thus, the tree roots cannot take up moisture as well. So what do you recommend as far as how we can circumvent that juxtaposition of poor growing conditions when we want to plant trees in areas, whether it's in our backyard or in wild places?
Well, you never know if a drought is going to develop if you do a tree planting, but you have to be prepared to water the trees. In Minneapolis, they do have a watering truck, and they will water the newly planted trees to the extent that they can. It's just a wild card. I mean, it helps if you planted the trees in 2019 and it rained all summer. You didn't have to do anything, and almost all of them survived. On the other hand, when you have a drought like we had last summer and this summer, where you get into the extreme drought category, you can have one of those alligator bags on the tree and keep it full all summer, and it still might die. No matter how much you water a tree, with the heat and the rate of evaporation that we had these last 2 summers, you can't keep them all alive.
Yeah, I planted, my wife and I planted a few hundred trees 2 years ago during the main drought, and watered them pretty regularly. But yeah, had roughly 90% mortality of them.
Yep.
Those alligator bags are great. 25 years ago, I used them for a number of trees, and they grew like crazy.
So Lee, can I ask you another question?
Sure.
So I live in an earth home, and so geothermal and solars are that's our dominant heat source. But we have a wood stove. We use it to get it up to comfortable temperatures during the winter time when needed. And I really don't like burning oak because we get these 120, 140-year-old trees that loggers are cutting down for firewood. So I'm thinking that it might be more conservation minded to switch to a pellet stove that utilizes the byproduct of the pine or the lumber industry. And it also utilizes a tree species that is shorter lived before it's harvested. So the net turnaround of carbon essentially would be nil relative to some of our oak species. You have any words of wisdom or thoughts? Have you thought about that issue on your own end?
Yeah, I have thought about it because I have a summer cabin and we heat with wood there. My conclusion is you should be growing wood on your own property faster than you're harvesting it to burn. And if you're not in that situation, you shouldn't be doing it. Or at least you could collaborate with local landowners and make sure that you can take trees that die from self-thinning in a forest, trees that blow down in windstorms and so on. And if you can get the amount of wood you need, either yourself or a local group of landowners, and the amount of wood in your forest is still increasing, you're still sequestering carbon, and you're not emitting tons of carbon dioxide, having to haul it miles to the point where it's going to be burned, then it's a good thing to do. So in our case, we have an older forest and we had several big old trees that died, and we had to cut them down anyway because they were going to fall on the house, and we have enough wood to last the next 20 years now stacked up in the woodshed. And so that's definitely the case for us. But yeah, this business of cutting firewood and reducing the average age of the trees in the forest and then hauling it miles to somewhere where you sell it and then it's hauled miles more, I just don't believe that can ever be carbon neutral.
Thanks for your response.
Yeah, and the pellets, I'm not sure. I don't know how much energy they emit making the pellet or how much CO2 they emit in the process of making the pellets. So can't really answer that one very well.
Well, I guess as a follow-up to that, Lee, we had essentially outsourcing the supply of wood then to other destinations that are practicing sustainable forestry practices, preferably choosing woods that, for harvest anyways, that have a shorter life cycle span, and retaining those trees, the wolf trees, so to speak, the large trees that get much older that store much more carbon, and retaining those in the forest canopy.
Yeah. Well, sometimes in an even-aged forest, you can take even-aged forests undergo self-thinning. So they'll start out with 10,000 trees per acre, and they'll get to 1,000, and eventually they'll reach a point where there's only 100 per acre. If you're a really good forester who knows how forests work, you can choose the trees that are going to die in the self-thinning process. Within a few years, you can cut those trees down and accelerate the growth of the other trees and get usable wood while still increasing the amount of CO2 sequestration in the forest. But you have to be a really good forester to do that. And there are foresters who can do that.
Sure, if you're not competing with the woodcock manager, right?
Yep.
Or the golden wing warbler. Yeah, so when we start to look at single species conservation practices across the board, it gets to be a little bit more of a complicated conversation as far as how to manage public forests.
Yep. Yeah, the Forest Stewardship Guild, for example, foresters who belong to that are generally really quite good at thinking about these things and doing things correctly.
Thanks, Lee. That was all my questions.
Can I go back to your comment on the Minneapolis forest staff? Do you have a name there of somebody?
Well, I don't know if he'll respond, but Ralph Sievert is the head of the forestry division.
What was his last name?
Sievert, oh boy, is it I-E or E-I? S-I-E-V-E-R-T.
Okay.
Ralph. He's the head. They do have some they do have some people who specialize in educating the public and so on, because it's a pretty big division.
Okay. I want them to educate my city staff.
Yeah, well, you can ask. They're so busy, I don't know if they'll have time to do it.
Yeah, yeah, okay,
But
thank you.
the Shade Tree Short Course, which is taught by the university every March at Bethel College, which is, I think, in Roseville,
Yeah,
is a good place for city foresters to learn all about the best urban forestry practices. And it's the week of spring break at the University of Minnesota. And urban foresters come from all over the state every year. And it's
and that's put on by, is that put in by the University of Minnesota?
Yes.
Okay,
Yep. It's called the Shade Tree Short Course. So it's a week-long intensive course on everything to do with urban trees.
okay, thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Lee. This has been a great discussion, and thank you so much for staying on past time. Very
Yeah, you're
interesting.
welcome.
Jason, did you have one last announcement, or did you cover all your announcements?
Oh, I think we're good.
Okay.
Did we mention no meeting in December and when our January meeting is?
No. So in December, we are going to be taking the month off from a meeting, and Jason is going to be pulling together a synopsis of the year. So look out for that video, and then we'll be resuming again in January. Just checking the date.
January 12th.
Yeah, Thursday, January 12th. So happy holidays to everyone, and we'll see you again in the new year. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.